The market square was bustling as usual, the air filled with the chatter of villagers and the sweet scent of fresh bread. But Miss Marple couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. As she sat on her usual bench, knitting in the quiet corner, her sharp eyes swept the crowd, noting the oddities, the way Mr. Reed's hand trembled as he sold his jams, the hushed whispers between Mrs. Turner and the butcher. Then, just as the clock struck noon, Mr. Reed was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving only his empty stall and a pocket watch in the ground, a watch that didn't belong to him. What had he seen? And who was trying so hard to make him disappear? The game had already begun, and Miss Marple was determined to find the answers, no matter how dark they might be. Chapter 1. The Disappearing Vendor. The bustling market square in the village of Fairham had always been a sight to behold. It was a place where the villagers gathered each week, exchanging gossip, fresh produce, and the occasional grumbling complaint about the weather. Today was no different. The sun hung high in the sky, casting a soft golden glow over the stalls, as the sweet scent of ripe apples and the earthy aroma of freshly baked bread filled the air. Miss Marple sat on her usual bench, tucked away beneath a large oak tree near the village green. Her small knitting needles clicked rhythmically, the sound blending with the hum of market activity. Her keen eyes, however, never stopped scanning her surroundings. It was her quiet way of staying connected to the village, a village she had known all her life. Among the busy crowd, one vendor caught her attention. Mr. Nigel Reed, a quiet, somewhat unassuming man who ran a small jam stall at the market. He was known for his delicious homemade jams, made from the berries that grew on his farm just outside of the village. His stall was modest, with jars neatly lined up on wooden shelves, their bright, colorful labels a testament to his careful craftsmanship. Miss Marple had known Mr. Reed for years, always finding him a gentle soul who kept mostly to himself. He wasn't one to draw attention, but today something was different. She couldn't quite place it, but something about the way he was acting struck her as odd. She watched as Mr. Reed spoke briefly to Mrs. Edith Turner, the elderly widow who had been a regular customer at his stall for as long as anyone could remember. The two exchanged a few words, and then, just as quickly as it had begun, Mrs. Turner walked away, her basket of jams in hand. But then, something strange happened. Miss Marple had been watching Mr. Reed's stall for some time when she suddenly realized he was gone. She looked around the market, searching the crowd. Had he stepped away briefly? Perhaps gone to fetch more supplies? No, the stall was completely abandoned. The jars of jam sat untouched, a slight breeze lifting the corner of a small tablecloth. There was no sign of Mr. Reed anywhere. She waited for a moment, expecting him to return. But when several minutes passed, Miss Marple's curiosity began to sharpen. She stood and walked over to the stall, glancing down at the neatly arranged rows of jars. No sign of a disturbance, no sign of a hasty departure. Everything was as it should be, except for the fact that Mr. Reed was nowhere to be found. A small knot of unease began to tighten in Miss Marple's chest. "Excuse me, Miss Marple." A voice suddenly interrupted her thoughts. She turned to find Thomas Baker, the young delivery boy, approaching her. His face was flushed and he was looking about nervously. "Have you seen Mr. Reed?" Thomas asked, glancing around the market. "Why, no, I haven't," Miss Marple replied with a slight frown. "Is he not at his stall?" The young man hesitated, glancing over his shoulder before leaning in closer. "I saw him talking to Mrs. Turner earlier, but after that I didn't see him leave." It's odd, isn't it? I mean, he's always at his stall on market days." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Something didn't sit right. "Thank you, Thomas," she said, her voice steady, but her thoughts were already racing. "I think I'll take a look around." As Thomas hurried off, Miss Marple took a few steps toward the back of the stall, her sharp eyes scanning the area. She noticed something unusual, the faintest of marks on the ground, like someone had been in a hurry. Then, near the corner of the stall, she saw something that made her freeze in place. A small, tarnished pocket watch lay discarded on the cobblestones, half hidden beneath a nearby crate of empty jars. It gleamed dully in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the rest of the busy market. The watch was exquisite, elegant even, and certainly not something Mr. Reed would normally own. Her mind flickered with questions. How did this watch end up here? Was it Mr. Reed's, or had it belonged to someone else? She bent down slowly, her fingers hovering over the watch but not yet touching it. Something about the situation felt wrong. Too wrong to be dismissed as a simple disappearance. Why would Mr. Reed, a man who had always been so dependable, vanish without a word? And what was this watch doing here, out of place? Before she could think further, a loud shout from across the market caught her attention. "Miss Marple!" "Have you seen Mr. Reed?" It was Mrs. Turner, her voice a mix of concern and confusion. Miss Marple straightened, casting one last glance at the abandoned stall and the watch on the ground. She smiled kindly at Mrs. Turner as she walked over. "Not yet, Edith, but I intend to find out." Miss Marple replied softly, her voice laced with quiet certainty. Something wasn't right here, and Miss Marple's sharp instincts told her this was only the beginning. As Mrs. Turner stood there, fidgeting with her purse, Miss Marple noticed the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. The old woman was hiding something. There was no doubt in Miss Marple's mind about that. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, and Miss Marple could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on her. Mr. Reed had vanished, but the question was, why? And who could possibly have a reason to make him disappear? And what of this watch? Miss Marple thought, her mind racing with possibilities. The stage was set for a mystery that would unspool in unexpected ways. But one thing was certain. Miss Marple would get to the bottom of it, no matter how long it took. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the market square, but the buzz of activity showed no sign of slowing. Miss Marple remained at the heart of the village, her mind whirring with unanswered questions. She had spent the better part of the afternoon trying to piece together the puzzle of Mr. Reed's sudden disappearance. Though everyone seemed to have a theory, no one had an explanation that made sense. Her knitting rested in her lap, forgotten for the moment as she leaned back on the bench, observing the stillness around her. Mrs. Turner had returned to her home after their brief chat, but something about the elderly woman's demeanor had troubled Miss Marple. She was too eager to appear innocent, too quick to offer explanations that rang false. The thought nagged at Miss Marple, but she hadn't yet gathered enough to confront her. The entire village seemed unaware of the sinister undertones lurking beneath their tranquil lives. But Miss Marple wasn't fooled. Something was off, and Mr. Reed's absence was no coincidence. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the market square again, where a slight commotion caught her attention. A small group of people had gathered near the butcher's stall, gossiping animatedly. She could barely hear their conversation from where she sat, but the murmurs were enough to pique her interest. She stood and made her way toward the crowd, her steps slow and measured, the weight of her thoughts heavy on her shoulders. He just vanished, didn't he? Strange, isn't it? Just like that, one of the voices said. Miss Marple moved closer, and as she did, the familiar voice of Thomas Baker reached her ears. He was speaking to an elderly woman, her face scrunched in concern. Thomas, Miss Marple interrupted, her tone calm but firm. What's this about Mr. Reed? Thomas turned, his expression shifting between nervous and relieved at the sight of her. Oh, Miss Marple, you won't believe it, but I overheard something strange, he began, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. I was delivering some parcels to the smithy when I overheard Mr. Reed talking to a man I didn't recognize. They were speaking in hushed tones, and I swear Mr. Reed looked, well, frightened. He was pale, almost sickly, and the other man, well, he was rather tall, wearing a long coat. I didn't catch much, but I'm sure it wasn't a friendly conversation. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she listened intently. Who was this stranger? And why was Mr. Reed so terrified? She asked, her voice soft. Thomas shook his head, his brow furrowed in confusion. No, Miss Marple. He was a stranger, but it was strange, the way Mr. Reed was acting, like he knew something he shouldn't have. I think he was trying to hide something. What can Mr. Reed know? Miss Marple's thoughts whirled. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the puzzle wasn't yet clear. She thanked Thomas and moved on. A new sense of urgency in her step. She needed to find out more about this mysterious man. Chapter 3. The Watch and the Strange Visitor. As Miss Marple turned to leave the cottage, her eyes fell upon something on the mantelpiece. There, among the clutter of everyday objects, was the very same pocket watch she had seen earlier at the market stall. It gleamed in the low light, its surface polished and smooth, almost out of place in the otherwise humble cottage. She stepped closer, feeling a twinge of unease. This watch doesn't belong here. She reached out and picked it up, turning it over in her hands. The engraving on the back was worn but still legible. For Victor, with love, 1897. A name. Victor. It wasn't a name she had heard before in connection with Mr. Reed, but it seemed to hold significance. Could this be the name of the stranger he had been speaking to? Or perhaps someone else connected to his past? Before she could investigate further, a noise from outside the house startled her. Miss Marple froze, her heart pounding. She peered cautiously through the window and saw a shadow moving along the side of the cottage. A tall figure dressed in a dark coat was walking toward the door. Miss Marple's mind raced. Could this be the man Thomas had seen with Mr. Reed? She quickly tucked the watch into her pocket and made her way toward the back door. The tall figure had already reached the front, his footsteps heavy on the dirt path. She would need to act fast. Cliffhanger ending. As Miss Marple turned to make her escape, her foot caught on a loose floorboard, sending a loud creak echoing through the quiet house. The figure outside froze, and Miss Marple's pulse quickened. There was no time to waste. She needed to leave before he saw her, but as she stepped quietly toward the door, the figure spoke, his voice smooth, but laced with menace. I know you're in there, Miss Marple. And I think we need to talk. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The game was afoot. Chapter 4. The Market's Dark Secret. The air was heavy with an approaching storm as Miss Marple carefully made her way back toward the heart of the village. The mysterious figure who had just confronted her outside Mr. Reed's cottage lingered in her thoughts, like a shadow refusing to leave. She had been on the brink of a breakthrough, but now she was faced with more questions than answers. The stranger had been tall, with a voice she couldn't quite place. It had been smooth, almost like the kind of voice one would associate with someone accustomed to power or authority. The way he spoke, so calmly, almost as if he knew Miss Marple, set her on edge. Who was he, and what connection did he have to Mr. Reed's disappearance? Something about him doesn't sit right. He knows too much. As the clouds darkened, Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. Mr. Reed's disappearance wasn't just an accident or a simple case of someone deciding to leave. There was something far more sinister at play here, and the village market, once a symbol of small-town tranquility, had now become the heart of a mystery much darker than she could have ever anticipated. Miss Marple's eyes darted toward the market square. The usual vendors were still there, going about their business, though their chatter seemed muted as if the sudden tension in the air had affected everyone. The bustle felt a bit off, as if something was waiting to snap. The shadows. A sharp glint caught Miss Marple's eye as she approached the butcher's stall. A shadow moved quickly in the corner of the square, too quick for a typical passerby. She instinctively turned, narrowing her eyes. There he was again. The tall figure from earlier. He was standing near the alley that led to the old mill, half hidden by a large barrel. His posture was rigid, like he was waiting for someone, or watching for something. Miss Marple had learned long ago that when something fell off, it often meant that something was amiss. She had to know more. A silent follow. Miss Marple moved slowly, deliberately, toward a small shop on the opposite side of the square. She pretended to browse through a basket of fresh produce, her back half turned as she glanced over her shoulder. The stranger didn't notice her. He was too focused on the path ahead, his eyes scanning the market and its surroundings. Miss Marple's heart quickened. This man was no ordinary villager. She waited until he moved down the alley just out of sight before deciding to follow. Keeping her distance, she moved as quietly as she could, careful not to draw attention. The alley led to a small courtyard at the back of a rundown building, the one that housed the old village inn. The building was dilapidated, with sagging walls and a faint odor of mildew hanging in the air. Miss Marple slowed as she neared the courtyard, making sure she didn't make a sound. From behind a wooden fence, she peered through the gaps, her eyes straining to catch a glimpse of the figure. The man stopped at the back door of the building, glancing over his shoulder one last time before knocking twice on the door. There was a moment of silence before the door creaked open, revealing a figure in the shadows. It was hard to make out the features, but the unmistakable outline of a tall woman stood in the doorway. A familiar face. Miss Marple's pulse raced as the door opened wider, revealing the woman in full. To her shock, it was none other than Mrs. Edith Turner, the kindly widow who had been so unnervingly polite earlier, the same woman who had spoken with Mr. Reed just before his disappearance. Edith Turner? But what is she doing here, with this man? Miss Marple's thoughts swirled in a storm of confusion. Mrs. Turner was a fixture in the village, a quiet woman who had lived in Fairham for decades. Why was she associating with a stranger? And what was the purpose of this secret meeting in the dead of the night? As Miss Marple strained to hear, she caught a few words, just enough to confirm her worst suspicions. You told him too much. He won't stop looking, Edith. It's not over. The man's voice was low and strained. I told you it wasn't supposed to happen this way, Mrs. Turner replied in a whisper, her voice cracking slightly. But he knows too much now. We can't let him live. Not after everything that happened. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected that Mrs. Turner was hiding something, but this was something far darker than she could have imagined. Then we'll do what we must. There's no going back now. We have to make sure the secret stays buried. With that, the door shut with a soft thud, leaving Miss Marple standing in the shadows, her heart racing as the weight of the revelation sank in. The cold truth. Miss Marple's mind raced. The stranger, who was he? And why was Mrs. Turner involved in this deadly game? The words she had overheard sent a shiver down her spine. He won't stop looking, Edith. It's not over. Who was he? Was it Mr. Reed? Had he learned something about Mrs. Turner and this mysterious man that he shouldn't have? Was this the reason he had vanished so suddenly? Miss Marple knew one thing for certain. Mrs. Turner had been involved in something much darker than anyone could have guessed. And it had to do with Mr. Reed's disappearance. A dangerous game. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves of the trees as Miss Marple turned to leave. She had learned something vital, but it wasn't enough. There was still too much she didn't understand. Who was the man in the alley? What was his connection to Mrs. Turner? And how did Mr. Reed fit into this web of secrets and lies? One thing was clear. Mrs. Turner was hiding something, and Miss Marple was going to find out what it was. But now, she had a new problem. If someone was willing to go to such lengths to keep a secret, that meant they would stop at nothing to ensure it stayed hidden. Miss Marple had just entered a much more dangerous game. As she made her way back toward the market square, the storm clouds overhead seemed to echo her thoughts. Dark, foreboding, and full of the promise of something far worse yet to come. Chapter 5. The Dark Secrets Unveiled. The wind howled through the narrow streets of Fairham, its icy fingers gripping the village like an unseen hand. Miss Marple pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she walked back to her cottage, her mind spinning with the revelations of the past few days. Mrs. Turner, the kind-hearted widow, and the mysterious stranger she had been seen meeting in secret, the puzzle pieces were falling into place, but there was still so much left to uncover. Something terrible is happening in this village, and Mr. Reed's disappearance is at the heart of it. Miss Marple thought, her pace quickening with each step. The danger was real, and with each clue she uncovered, it seemed to grow closer to home. She had spent hours pondering the conversation she had overheard between Mrs. Turner and the stranger. The woman's tremor of guilt, the stranger's cold threats, they were no mere coincidence. And the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became. Mr. Reed had discovered something monumental, something that had put him in the path of people who would go to any length to protect their secrets. Her mind kept circling back to the note she had found at Mr. Reed's cottage, the warning to leave before it was too late. It was clear now that Mr. Reed's disappearance wasn't voluntary. Someone had forced him into hiding, or worse, silenced him completely. A visit to the manor. Miss Marple knew that, in order to understand the depths of this mystery, she needed to confront Mrs. Turner directly. But before she could do that, she needed more information. Mrs. Turner had been associated with Mr. Reed for years, but it was clear that her ties to him weren't as innocent as they seemed. The next morning, Miss Marple set her sights on a place she had avoided for some time. Ashwood Manor, the sprawling estate on the outskirts of Fairham. It belonged to none other than Gerald Wentworth, a wealthy landowner who had recently returned to the village after many years abroad. Miss Marple had heard whispers about Wentworth's connections to various local figures, including Mrs. Turner. It was said that he had a fascination with the darker aspects of the village's history, says something that did not sit well with the more traditional folk. He had been a shadow in Fairham for weeks, and now Miss Marple was determined to find out why. She arrived at Ashwood Manor just as the afternoon sun began to dip, casting long shadows over the grounds. The estate was as grand as it was imposing, with its wrought iron gates and ivy-covered stone walls. Miss Marple approached the door with a sense of purpose, though her heart fluttered with the knowledge that she might be stepping into the lion's den. A butler, pale and stiff, greeted her at the door, his cold eyes betraying no emotion as he allowed her into the vast, dimly lit foyer. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you again." Gerald Wentworth's voice boomed from the stairs above. He appeared at the top, his figure tall and imposing. He smiled warmly, but there was something about his smile that made Miss Marple uneasy. "Good afternoon, Mr. Wentworth," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but edged with suspicion. "I was hoping to have a word with you." A rather delicate matter. Wentworth's smile faltered for a brief moment before he descended the staircase, his polished shoes clicking softly at the marble floor. "Of course, Miss Marple. I was hoping you'd come by. We do have some unfinished business, don't we?" The web tightens. Miss Marple took a seat in the grand parlor, her eyes sweeping over the opulent surroundings. Rich tapestries, ornate furniture, and an array of antiques filled the room, but it was the shadows that caught her attention. There was something oppressive about this house, as if the walls themselves were hiding secrets. "I've heard rumors about your recent return to Fairham, Mr. Wentworth," Miss Marple began, her tone polite but pointed. "It seems there's much more to your presence here than simply a desire to reconnect with old acquaintances." Wentworth chuckled, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed in the room. "Rumors, Miss Marple? You know how people love to gossip in this quaint little village. But if you're suggesting that I have any dark purpose for returning, I assure you, you're mistaken." Miss Marple didn't flinch. She had heard enough of his words to know that they were more evasive than honest. "Perhaps you can explain then, Mr. Wentworth?" Miss Marple continued, her gaze narrowing. "What business do you have with Mrs. Edith Turner? Why was she meeting with a stranger in secret just days before Mr. Reed disappeared?" Wentworth's demeanor shifted, his smile disappeared, and for a brief moment his eyes flickered with something. Fear? Guilt? Miss Marple couldn't be sure, but she saw it. "Mrs. Turner and I go way back," Wentworth said, his voice now cold and controlled. "We were old friends before I left Fairham. As for Mr. Reed, he was a simple man who got too curious for his own good." Miss Marple pressed further, her voice steady. "Curious about what, Mr. Wentworth? What exactly did Mr. Reed discover that was so dangerous?" Wentworth's jaw tightened, and Miss Marple could see the muscles in his neck twitch. He was trying to keep his composure, but the cracks were beginning to show. "Miss Marple, you're digging into things that you don't fully understand," Wentworth said, his voice taking on a warning edge. "Some secrets are better left buried. Trust me, it's safer for everyone that way." At that moment, Miss Marple knew she was on the right track. Wentworth's reaction was proof enough. But he wasn't going to come clean so easily. A silent threat. As Miss Marple prepared to leave the manor, she felt the weight of Wentworth's words hanging over her like a suffocating fog. "You know, Miss Marple," Wentworth said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "sometimes people ask too many questions. It's not always healthy, especially when there are things best left in the past." Miss Marple didn't respond. Instead, she nodded politely and walked toward the door. But just before she stepped out, Wentworth's voice stopped her. "Be careful, Miss Marple. Some mysteries are better left unsolved." The door slammed shut behind her, and Miss Marple found herself standing on the steps of Ashwood Manor, her heart pounding. Something dangerous is at play here. Wentworth knows far more that he's letting on, and Mrs. Turner is deeper into this than I ever imagined. Miss Marple thought, her mind racing with possibilities. The final revelation. A closer look. As she walked back through the village, Miss Marple's mind kept returning to the same thought. Mr. Reed had discovered something that went beyond a simple crime, something that threatened the very foundation of Fairham itself. She had only begun to scratch the surface, but the deeper she dug, the clearer it became that no one, especially Mr. Reed, could be allowed to uncover what was hidden in this village's past. But Miss Marple was not one to be intimidated. She had always known that the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous, would eventually come to light. And when it did, the villains in this twisted game would pay for what they had done, and she would see to it that they did. Chapter 6. The Final Connection. The night was eerily quiet as Miss Marple made her way down the narrow streets of Fairham, her footsteps echoing softly in the cold, damp air. The storm that had threatened all day had finally arrived, and now the village was shrouded in mist. The once familiar streets now twisted and ominous in the dim light. She had learned more in the past few days than she could have ever anticipated, but she still lacked the final piece to solve the puzzle. Gerald Wentworth, the tall, cold man who had been so quick to dismiss her suspicions, had given her the most chilling warning. Some secrets are better left buried. His veiled threat only confirmed that he knew far more than he was willing to admit. Miss Marple had seen enough to know that he and Mrs. Edith Turner were hiding something much darker than anyone had guessed. Something terrible happened between them. I know it. And Mr. Reed had stumbled upon it. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had a few suspicions, but she needed something concrete, a final revelation, a connection that would tie everything together, a conversation in the dark. Miss Marple's mind kept returning to the strange cryptic message in the note she'd found in Mr. Reed's cottage. "You must leave before it's too late. We know what you've discovered. There's no way out." It was clear now that whoever had written that note knew exactly what Reed had uncovered, and they were willing to kill to keep it hidden. But what was it? She paused, standing at the edge of the market square, her sharp eyes scanning the empty stalls. The place was deserted, but it had once been full of life, full of secrets. Mr. Reed had been part of the fabric of the village. His disappearance had rocked Fairham, but no one had connected the dots between his sudden vanishing and the whispers about Ashwood Manor, or Mrs. Turner. Miss Marple had an idea, but it was dangerous. She needed to go back to the old mill, the one located on the outskirts of the village, near the edge of the woods. It was a place that most villagers had long forgotten, a crumbling relic from a time before Fairham had become the peaceful, quiet town it was now. But there was one person who remembered the mill. Edith Turner. Mrs. Turner had been unusually evasive when Miss Marple had questioned her about the night Mr. Reed had disappeared. Something in her eyes had told Miss Marple that the old woman was hiding a truth that had the potential to unravel everything. But why the mill? Miss Marple asked herself. Something told her that this mill, abandoned for decades, had played a pivotal role in the secrets of the past. She had no proof, but her instincts were never wrong. The truth beneath the surface. The mill was as Miss Marple had imagined, dark, damp, and decaying. The wind howled through the trees as she approached, the heavy scent of mildew and wood rot filling the air. As she neared the door, Miss Marple hesitated. She had no idea what she would find inside, but she was certain that the answers were buried here, answers that had eluded her thus far. She pushed open the heavy wooden door with a creak, her heart pounding in her chest. The mill was dark, save for the faint sliver of moonlight streaming through a crack in the wall. Miss Marple's eyes adjusted to the gloom, and she moved cautiously inside. The place had been abandoned for years, nothing but forgotten machinery, rusted gears, and broken windows. But something caught her eye, a small trapdoor near the far corner of the room, half hidden under a pile of old crates. She approached it carefully, her footsteps slow and deliberate. The trapdoor seemed out of place, newer than the rest of the mill, as if it had been added recently. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she knelt beside it. She could feel it now. The secret she had been looking for was right beneath her feet. With a grunt, she pried open the trapdoor. Beneath it was a narrow staircase that led into the bowels of the mill. She hesitated only a moment before descending, her heart thudding in her chest. The air grew colder as she descended, the musty scent of earth and old wood growing stronger with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, the darkness seemed almost impenetrable. But Miss Marple was used to navigating in the dark, her senses finely attuned to the slightest sound, the faintest shift in the air. She reached for her pocket watch and flicked open the small, flickering lantern she had brought along. The soft glow revealed a narrow passageway ahead, lined with old wooden crates and barrels. There were cobwebs in every corner, and the dampness of the place clung to her skin. She moved forward, scanning the surroundings, when something on the floor caught her eye. A series of footprints, large, muddy, and fresh. The footprints led deeper into the passageway toward an iron door at the end of the hall. Something's hidden here. But what? Miss Marple thought as she approached the door. The hidden chamber. The door was old, but it opened easily under Miss Marple's careful touch. She stepped inside, and her lantern light revealed a hidden chamber. A small, dimly lit room lined with old crates, faded documents, and dusty shelves. But what immediately drew her attention was a large wooden desk in the center of the room, scattered with papers. The papers were old, but some of them were marked with the same engraving she had seen on Mr. Reed's pocket watch. For Victor, with love, 1897. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. Victor. The name appeared several times on the documents, along with references to the deal. A deal that had been struck between several key individuals in the village many years ago. There were notes detailing payments, plans, and names. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she sifted through the pages. And then she found it. The final connection. The documents detailed a criminal enterprise that had been operating in Fairham for decades. It involved money laundering, illegal transactions, and a cover-up that reached the highest echelons of the village's social structure. Gerald Wentworth and Edith Turner had both been involved, as had several others, including Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed had stumbled upon the secret. He had discovered the hidden ledger in the mill, a ledger that could expose everything, the shocking truth. Miss Marple's thoughts raced as the pieces fell into place. The enterprise wasn't just about money, it was about control. Those behind it had been pulling strings in the village for years, ensuring that their dark activities stayed hidden. But Mr. Reed had found out, and when he did, he had been silenced because he knew too much. Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat as she realized the full scope of the conspiracy. But what stunned her more was the realization of who else had been involved. A figure, Victor, the man from the engraving on the pocket watch, had been none other than the founder of the criminal organization. And now, his legacy was still alive, protected by Mrs. Turner, Gerald Wentworth, and others in the village. The final confrontation. Miss Marple stood in the dark room, the weight of the truth pressing down on her. She knew now what had happened to Mr. Reed and why he had disappeared. She had uncovered the final piece. But the question remained, what would she do with it? The storm outside grew louder, as if the heavens themselves were anticipating the coming storm. One that would reveal all of Fairham's darkest secrets. And Miss Marple was determined to bring it to light, no matter the cost. Chapter 7. The Circle Closes. The storm outside had only worsened since Miss Marple's discovery at the mill. Rain hammered the cobblestones with relentless fury, the wind howling like a creature of the night. But the weather did nothing to deter Miss Marple. In fact, it seemed only to fuel her determination. The truth was now painfully clear. Mr. Reed had been murdered, not by a single person, but by a dangerous network of individuals who would stop at nothing to protect their hidden empire. People she had trusted, people she had known for years, were involved. Edith Turner and Gerald Wentworth, their involvement in the conspiracy was undeniable. But there was more, much more. Something still doesn't sit right. Miss Marple thought as she sat at her desk in the dim light of her small cottage. The pages she had discovered in the hidden chamber were strewn across the table in front of her, each one a piece of the intricate puzzle that now consumed her every thought. But despite her findings, there was one question that lingered in the back of her mind. Why had Mr. Reed suddenly decided to confront them? He had known something, of that she was certain. But what had pushed him to act when he did? What had made him so certain that exposing the conspiracy was the right thing to do? The missing link. Miss Marple picked up the page she had nearly overlooked earlier, a yellowed, crinkled note buried deep within the papers. It was short, scribbled hastily, in a hand she didn't recognize. The ink was smeared as if the writer had been in a hurry. "Meet me at the mill. Midnight. I have what you're looking for." V.V. The name stood out. She had already seen it repeatedly in the documents she had found, but now, seeing it here again, it clicked. Victor. The man who had started it all. The man whose legacy had created this tangled web of deceit, crime, and murder. And suddenly, Miss Marple understood. Mr. Reed hadn't simply stumbled upon the conspiracy by accident. He had been tipped off. Someone had wanted him to find the truth. Her fingers trembled as she reread the note. Meet me at the mill. Midnight. It wasn't Mr. Reed's handwriting, but it had been his decision to go. Victor had set the trap, and Mr. Reed had walked right into it, believing he was about to expose the truth. The trap is set. Miss Marple's mind raced. She needed to act fast. There was no time to lose. She had discovered the truth about the criminal enterprise, but the key players were still out there, still operating in the shadows, pulling the strings. She needed to bring everything into the light before anyone else could be silenced. But there was one final piece of the puzzle she needed to confirm. Victor. Who was he? Really? And where was he now? The answer came quickly, almost too quickly, when Miss Marple thought back to her earlier conversations. Victor wasn't just a figurehead from the past. He was someone still alive, still pulling the strings from behind the scenes. And he had been working in the shadows, hiding in plain sight. She felt a chill run down her spine as she put it all together. Victor was none other than Gerald Wentworth. The final confrontation. Everything clicked into place. Gerald Wentworth, the seemingly aloof, wealthy landowner, had been hiding in plain sight the entire time. He was Victor, the mastermind behind the criminal empire that had taken root in Fairham for decades. Mrs. Turner had been his accomplice, and together, they had manipulated everyone in the village. Mr. Reed had discovered their secret, and they had to silence him before he exposed them. Miss Marple stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. The pieces were all in place, but there was still one last step. She needed to confront Wentworth. As she walked out into the rain-soaked streets, she knew exactly where she needed to go. Ashwood Manor, the place that had seemed so imposing, so grand, would now become the stage for the final confrontation. Miss Marple's resolve hardened. The truth would come to light tonight, and the people who had stained Fairham's quiet streets with their lies and blood would answer for their crimes. Ashwood Manor. The truth revealed. Miss Marple arrived at Ashwood Manor just as the storm reached its peak. The towering gates loomed before her, the manor dark and silent in the rain-soaked night. She walked toward the door with purpose, her heart steady but her thoughts still racing. The butler answered, looking almost as pale as the moonlight that filtered through the heavy clouds. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect you," the butler said, his voice faltering. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. "Mr. Wentworth is expecting me," Miss Marple replied, her voice sharp and certain. The butler didn't object, and Miss Marple followed him through the long, shadowy corridors of the manor, her footsteps quiet but sure. They reached the study, where Wentworth sat behind his large oak desk, the fireplace casting flickering shadows on his face. Miss Marple," Wentworth said, his voice smooth, but there was a flicker of something dark behind his eyes. "I wondered when you'd figure it out." "I figured it out," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm but cutting. "Everything? You, Mrs. Turner, Mr. Reed, it's all connected, isn't it?" Wentworth's smile twisted into something darker. "You really are a clever woman, aren't you?" "Too clever for your own good, I'm afraid." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "You never thought I'd uncover the truth, did you? But I've already seen the papers, the notes, everything. You were Victor, weren't you? The mastermind behind the criminal empire, and you knew Mr. Reed would come too close to the truth." Wentworth's eyes flickered, but he quickly regained his composure. "You don't understand, Miss Marple. This isn't just about greed. This was about survival. The money, the power, everything we built was for a reason. You think it's all just about stealing from the village, but you're wrong. There's much more at stake here than you can imagine." Miss Marple stepped forward, her voice steady. "And the price for your empire was Mr. Reed's life, wasn't it? He was just a man who wanted to do the right thing, and you murdered him for it." Wentworth's smile faltered, replaced by a dark expression. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. Reed was a threat to everything we've worked for. He couldn't be allowed to live. And neither can you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's heart raced. She had no illusions about Wentworth's ability to act on his threats. The man was dangerous, and she was now deep in the lion's den. The twist. The hand of justice. Before Miss Marple could react, the door to the study burst open, and Edith Turner stepped inside, her face pale but her eyes hard and resolute. She wasn't here to help Wentworth. "I'm sorry, Gerald," she said, her voice trembling. "But this ends now." With a swift movement, Mrs. Turner produced a small pistol from beneath her shawl. Wentworth froze, his eyes narrowing as he looked at her in disbelief. "You were going to kill her, weren't you?" Mrs. Turner continued, her voice filled with a strange mixture of sorrow and resolve. You were going to kill her just like you killed Reed." Wentworth's face twisted with rage. "You fool," he hissed. "You don't understand. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about the future." Mrs. Turner's hands trembled as she aimed the gun at Wentworth. "I've been part of your secret for far too long, but not anymore. The truth comes out now." In that moment, the door to the study slammed open again, and the sound of footsteps approached quickly. The village constable, having followed Miss Marple's trail, rushed in with a group of officers. Wentworth's face paled as he realized the walls were closing in. There was no escape. The final justice. Miss Marple watched as the officers subdued Wentworth and Mrs. Turner lowered the pistol. The truth had come out, but the victory felt hollow. In the end, Gerald Wentworth, the man who had thought himself untouchable, would face the consequences of his crimes. And Fairham, for the first time in years, would be free of the darkness that had haunted it for so long. Miss Marple stood silently in the corner of the room, her mind racing with the weight of everything she had uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and she had finally brought justice to a village that had long been blind to the secrets buried within it. But there was one thought that lingered in her mind. No one could ever truly escape the consequences of their actions, not even those who thought they had buried the truth for good. Chapter 8. The Final Hours. The sky above Fairham was a bruised shade of gray, the clouds heavy with the promise of more rain. Miss Marple walked slowly along the village streets, the distant rumble of thunder echoing through the air. She had done what she could. She had exposed the dark underbelly of Fairham's quiet streets, revealed the treachery of those who had thought themselves above the law. But despite the victory over Gerald Wentworth and Mrs. Turner, the unsettling feeling in the pit of her stomach hadn't quite faded. Something's still not right. This is only half the story. Miss Marple thought as she walked toward the village square, her mind turning over the events that had unfolded in the past few days. Yes, Wentworth was in custody, and Mrs. Turner would face justice as well. But the shadow of something bigger still loomed over the village. Her intuition, always sharp, was telling her that the final piece of the puzzle was still hidden, somewhere in the quiet, crumbling corners of Fairham. A dangerous warning. The heavy rain began to fall, just as Miss Marple reached the village square. She paused beneath the old stone archway, her eyes scanning the now empty market stalls, the cobblestones slick with water. But then a movement caught her eye. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Miss Marple had learned to trust her instincts. A figure emerged from the shadow of a building across the square. A tall man, his face obscured by the brim of his hat, stepped forward, his footsteps silent in the rain. He was headed straight for her. Miss Marple's heart quickened, and she instinctively took a step back, just enough to be hidden in the shadows. The man had the same cold, calculating air that she had sensed from Gerald Wentworth, but there was something different about him. He wasn't part of the conspiracy she had already exposed, at least not in the way she had imagined. The figure stopped just a few feet away from Miss Marple. For a moment, there was silence, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The man was waiting, as if he knew she was there, watching. Then, in a voice low and urgent, he spoke. "You've come too close to the truth, Miss Marple." Miss Marple's breath caught in her throat. So, someone else knew. Someone who wasn't just trying to cover up their crimes, but someone who had been pulling strings from the shadows. "What do you want?" Miss Marple asked, her voice steady despite the unease crawling along her spine. The figure remained silent for a beat before replying. "I'm here to warn you. You think you've solved everything, but there's more. You don't know who you're really dealing with." The man's voice dropped lower, the threat in his tone unmistakable. "Stop before you find out the hard way." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. This wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice cool, her gaze never wavering from the shadowed figure. The man's lips curled into a thin, almost mocking smile. "You'll find out soon enough. But you'll wish you hadn't." Before Miss Marple could respond, the man turned and disappeared into the rain, his footsteps fading into the distance. A new threat emerges shaken, but not frightened. Miss Marple stood motionless for a long moment. The words of the mysterious man echoed in her mind. "Stop before you find out the hard way." Miss Marple was no stranger to threats, but this felt different, more personal. Whoever this was, they weren't just someone trying to protect Wentworth's criminal empire. They were someone who had been lurking in the shadows from the very beginning. Someone even more dangerous than she had realized. She turned and headed straight for the constable's office. The storm had intensified, and the village streets were now deserted, the quiet oppressive. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She wasn't about to be intimidated by a nameless shadow, but this was no longer just about justice. It was about her own survival. As she approached the constable's office, Miss Marple's mind raced. Had Wentworth really been the mastermind of the entire conspiracy, or had she only uncovered the surface of a much larger operation? The man in the square had hinted at something darker, something deeper. It seemed clear now that someone else had been behind everything. Someone who had the power to silence even the most determined of investigators. She stepped inside the constable's office and found Constable Hardwick pacing behind his desk, a look of exhaustion on his face. His eyes lifted when Miss Marple entered, but he didn't seem surprised to see her. "I was just about to come looking for you," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "We've got a problem." "I've just had a conversation with someone who seems to know an awful lot about this case," Miss Marple replied, her voice calm, but with an edge of urgency. "But I don't think it's Wentworth anymore." Constable Hardwick raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "I think Wentworth was only a small part of something bigger. There's someone else pulling the strings. Someone who's willing to do anything to keep their secrets buried." She paused, her eyes hardening. "And I think they're going to try and silence me." The constable frowned. "Who are you talking about, Miss Marple?" "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out, and I'll need your help." A hidden past. The hours passed quickly as Miss Marple and Constable Hardwick worked through the night, piecing together the fragments of the conspiracy that had plagued the village. They went over the documents Miss Marple had found at the mill, focusing on the names that appeared repeatedly, names that seemed to point to people who were not part of the original conspiracy at all. One name kept popping up in the documents: Victor Lytton. It seemed that he was somehow connected to Wentworth, but unlike the others, he didn't have a direct role in the operation. He was someone who had kept to the shadows, someone whose influence had been far-reaching, but invisible. As Miss Marple and Hardwick dug deeper, the pieces began to fall into place. Victor Lytton was not just a name, it was a legacy. He had been the founder of the operation, but he had died years ago, leaving behind a network of loyal followers. Wentworth had taken over the reins of the operation, but it was Lytton's followers who had kept the organization running. "Lytton's followers," Miss Marple murmured as the realization hit her. "They're the ones behind this, aren't they? And they'll stop at nothing to protect their secrets." The storm breaks. Just as the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the village, Constable Hardwick's phone rang. He answered it quickly, his face turning ashen, as he listened to the voice at the other end. Miss Marple watched as his expression shifted from confusion to concern. "It's gone," he said, his voice low. "Everything. The entire evidence cache. Everything we've collected. It's all been wiped." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The final proof, the documents, the connections, had vanished in the night, stolen before they could be used to bring the criminals to justice. It was clear now. The storm was just beginning. Chapter 9. The Unmasking. The first light of dawn broke through the heavy clouds, casting a pale, unwelcoming glow over the village. Fairham, usually a tranquil place, felt different now. Darker, more oppressive. The storm had not only shaken the skies, but had also unearthed secrets that had lain dormant for years. Miss Marple stood in her cottage, staring out the window, her thoughts churning. Everything she had uncovered, the conspiracy, the manipulation, the murder, had led her to one inescapable conclusion. Someone powerful, someone who had the resources to erase evidence and silence witnesses, was still out there. The final pieces of the puzzle were still slipping through her fingers, like grains of sand. The stolen evidence, the cache of documents that could have brought the criminals to justice, was now gone. And the mysterious man she had encountered the night before had left her with only one thing. A chilling warning. Find out the hard way. What does that mean? The threat still hung in the air. But now, Miss Marple knew. She had come too close to the truth. There was no turning back. The visit to Ashwood Manor. Miss Marple's resolve was stronger than ever. There was no more running from the truth. She had to confront Victor Lytton's legacy, the man whose death had allowed the conspiracy to fester in the shadows. It was time to uncover the last layer of this mystery, the mastermind who had operated from behind the scenes. And so, despite the storm and the mounting danger, Miss Marple made her way to Ashwood Manor. She had already suspected Gerald Wentworth was only a puppet in a much larger operation, but there was something more, someone more, waiting to be uncovered. Ashwood Manor loomed large against the stormy sky, its windows dark and uninviting. The gates creaked as she approached, and the familiar, imposing presence of the estate felt more foreboding than ever. Miss Marple took a deep breath as she walked up the stone steps to the massive front door. This time, there would be no polite pleasantries. She had come to unearth the truth no matter what it took. The butler greeted her at the door again, his face a mask of calm. "Miss Marple, it's been a long night. I'll let Mr. Wentworth know you're here." "No need," Miss Marple replied, her voice hard with resolve. "I'm here to see someone else." The butler blinked, clearly confused. "But Miss Marple—" "I'm not here to discuss old debts with Mr. Wentworth," she interrupted. "I'm here to talk to the real mastermind." The butler's face paled. "I don't understand what you mean, Miss Marple." Miss Marple stepped inside, her eyes never leaving the butler's face. "I think you do, Mr. Fallow." "It's time to stop hiding. I've learned enough to know who's been pulling the strings all along, and now I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth." The confession. The butler led Mrs. Marple down a darkened corridor toward a room at the back of the manor. The house felt strangely silent, the air thick with secrets. When they reached the door, the butler hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "Please, Miss Marple," he pleaded, "you don't know what you're doing. Mr. Lytton is—" Miss Marple stepped forward, pushing the door open herself. The scene before her was nothing like what she had expected. Inside the room stood Gerald Wentworth. But it wasn't his face that shocked her. It was the figure standing beside him, Mrs. Edith Turner, her hands trembling as she held a set of papers in her hand. And then, in the far corner, standing behind a desk draped with shadows, was a figure she had not expected to see. Victor Lytton, or rather his son, Jonathan Lytton. The man was tall, with the same cold, calculating eyes as his father had been rumored to possess. His presence in the room explained everything. Victor Lytton had never truly disappeared. His son had taken up the mantle, continuing the legacies of criminal manipulations and power. "I'm glad you finally figured it out, Miss Marple," Jonathan Lytton said smoothly, his voice chilling in its calmness. "I must admit, I was starting to think you were too clever for your own good." Miss Marple's heart pounded in her chest. So this was the man who had truly been behind the operation. Gerald Wentworth, Mrs. Turner, and the rest had been mere puppets in his game. Victor Lytton died many years ago, but his legacy lives on, Jonathan continued, his voice filled with pride. "My father built an empire, and I have only expanded it. The people of Fairham, like Mr. Reed, are just pawns. They never understood what was really at stake." Miss Marple's hands clenched into fists. She had known there was more to this conspiracy than Wentworth. Now it all made sense. "And you killed Mr. Reed to keep the secret safe," Miss Marple said, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. Jonathan smiled coldly. "He was a threat. He was going to expose us all. He was too clever for his own good, just like you." "And you thought you could silence him?" Miss Marple replied, her gaze unwavering. "Just like you'll try to silence me." Jonathan Lytton's smile faded. "You've come too far, Miss Marple. You've already discovered too much, but this will be your last mistake." The final stand. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed through the manor, followed by the sound of rushing footsteps. Miss Marple's heart raced. She had anticipated this moment, but she hadn't expected the timing to be so precise. The door burst open, and Constable Hardwick, followed by a group of officers, stormed into the room. The constable's face was grim as he stepped forward, his hand gripping the pistol at his side. "Lytton," Hardwick said, his voice steady but filled with authority. "You're under arrest for the murder of Mr. Reed and for the operation of a criminal conspiracy that has plagued this village for years. The game is over." Jonathan Lytton's face twisted in fury. "You think this changes anything? You think you can stop what my father started?" He stepped forward, his hand reaching for the drawer of the desk, but before he could pull it open, a shot rang out. The officers flanked the room quickly, guns drawn, securing the area. The constable stepped forward, his expression steely. "Put your hands where I can see them, Lytton. The law catches up with everyone." For a moment, Jonathan Lytton hesitated, his dark eyes darting between the officers and Miss Marple. Then, realizing that escape was impossible, he slumped back into his chair, defeated. "You may have stopped me for now, Miss Marple," he sneered, "but this will be far from over." Miss Marple met his gaze with unwavering calm. "It ends now," she said. "There's no more hiding in the shadows." The true culprit revealed. With Lytton's arrest, the full extent of the conspiracy was laid bare. As the officers searched the room, they uncovered more damning evidence, files, records, and hidden accounts that proved beyond doubt the extent of the criminal empire Lytton had built. From money laundering to illicit dealings, the Lytton family had been at the center of a vast network that had long poisoned the village of Fairham. Miss Marple had been right to press on, even when the threat loomed large. The case was closed, but the victory felt bittersweet. The truth had been revealed, but lives had been lost. And the shadows of the past had left their mark on the village. As the sun began to rise, breaking through the clouds that had lingered for so long, Miss Marple turned to leave Ashwood Manor. Her work was done. But the village would never be the same. Fairham had been freed from the grasp of the Lyttons. But Miss Marple knew that justice came at a cost. The quiet, peaceful village she had once known would have to rebuild, piece by piece. And for Miss Marple, the truth had come at last. But as always, she knew there would always be another mystery, another truth to uncover. That was the way of the world. Chapter 10. The Echoes of Justice. The storm had finally passed. The morning sun, pale and uncertain, cast a weak light over the village of Fairham, its rays piercing through the thick, lingering mist. The quiet town, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt like a place suspended between the shadows of its past and the uncertain light of its future. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the village square, her eyes scanning the scene. The stalls, which had been filled with life just days ago, now stood empty and forlorn. The market square had once been a place of simple joys, but now it was a silent reminder of everything that had transpired. What a difference a few days make. Miss Marple thought as she walked toward the center of the square, her footsteps echoing in the quiet morning. The truth had been revealed. The mastermind, Jonathan Lytton, was in custody. His criminal empire dismantled piece by piece. Gerald Wentworth, once the puppet master, had been exposed as nothing more than a pawn. And Edith Turner, who had long hidden her own complicity in the operation, was now facing the consequences of her actions. But the victory, while satisfying, felt hollow. It wasn't just the Lytton family's reign of terror that had ended. It was also the innocence of Fairham itself. Miss Marple had torn the veil off a place she had known all her life, exposing the corruption and lies that had poisoned it. And now, there was no going back. The last conversations. Miss Marple had made her rounds through the village, speaking to the few who remained in Fairham after the storm. There were whispers of gratitude, but also fear. Fear of what had been revealed. Fear of what had been lost. For some, the truth had been a relief, but for others, it had been too much to bear. She had spoken with Constable Hardwick, who had offered his congratulations on her success, but Miss Marple had noticed the weariness in his eyes. The battle had taken its toll on everyone, and the village was exhausted. Even the constable, who had once been a figure of authority, now seemed like a man who had seen too much. Miss Marple, Hardwick had said as they stood near the now abandoned market stalls. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in. You've saved this village from more destruction than anyone could have imagined. Perhaps, Miss Marple had replied, her voice steady but laced with a hint of sadness. But the damage has been done. Even the smallest of villages hides its darkest secrets. A shadow lingers. It was nearing dusk when Miss Marple reached her cottage. She had walked the village one last time, trying to piece together the aftermath of the day's revelations. The once vibrant community had been shattered, its facade broken by the criminal activities that had been allowed to fester beneath its surface for so long. But it was not the village itself that still troubled her. It was the final pieces of the puzzle that still haunted her mind. The mystery had been solved. Lytton's criminal empire had been exposed, and justice was being served. But there was still something lurking in the background, something she couldn't shake. As Miss Marple entered her cottage, she paused by the window. The rain had stopped, but the wet street still gleamed, reflecting the pale glow of the street lamps. Her gaze drifted to the distant hills, shrouded in mist. What's missing here? What haven't I seen yet? She wondered as an unsettling feeling began to rise in her chest. The truth had come at great cost, and while the criminals had been arrested, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel as though there was still one more thing she needed to understand. Something was still out of place. The final letter. That night, as Miss Marple sat by the fire, she received a letter, delivered by hand, its paper heavy with importance. The handwriting was neat, precise, and unfamiliar. She opened it carefully, her fingers tracing the edges of the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, and the words on it were short, direct, and shocking. Miss Marple, you have solved much, but not all. The truth you seek lies not in the past, but in the future. You have been a thorn in our side, but there are forces much greater than you understand. Watch your back. J.L. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The initials J.L. were unmistakable. Jonathan Lytton. But how could this be? Lytton was in custody, locked away, unable to communicate with the outside world. Her mind raced. Had there been another layer to the conspiracy she had missed? Had the true force behind Lytton's empire never been fully revealed? No. This doesn't make sense. Miss Marple's hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down on the table. The warning, so cryptic, carried a weight she couldn't ignore. She had uncovered the dark secrets of the village. But the note suggested something far bigger, something that reached beyond the borders of Fairham. The second layer. As she sat in the quiet of her cottage, Miss Marple considered everything she had learned over the past days. It wasn't just Lytton's criminal network that had been at the heart of the conspiracy, it was the system that allowed it to continue. A system of manipulation and control that had ensnared so many people. But who was the real power behind it all? Miss Marple asked herself. The letter had been a warning, one that she couldn't afford to ignore. The storm had passed, but Miss Marple knew that the darkness hadn't completely dissipated. She had exposed the corruption within the village, but the letter hinted at something far larger, something that had been carefully hidden, perhaps beyond Fairham's borders. And that meant the mystery wasn't truly solved. A chill crept up Miss Marple's spine as she realized the truth. This was only the beginning. A new direction. The next morning, after. The sun had risen and the village slowly began to wake. Miss Marple paid a final visit to the constable. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was still lurking in the shadows. Jonathan Lytton had been arrested, but his cryptic letter seemed to suggest that the conspiracy was far from over. Hardwick, though weary, listened closely as Miss Marple shared her concerns. Are you suggesting that someone is still out there? He asked, his face creased with worry. I don't know, Miss Marple replied, her voice calm but filled with resolve. But I've seen enough to know that the web of lies we've uncovered was just the surface. I believe that someone else, someone we haven't yet identified, has been working behind the scenes. Hardwick's eyes narrowed. You're saying that the Lytton family might still have allies? Yes, Miss Marple said, her gaze sharp. And I suspect that they won't stop until every thread of their influence is untangled. The constable sighed. You've done enough, Miss Marple. The village is free of them now. We've arrested everyone involved in the conspiracy. But you're missing the point, Miss Marple said, her voice hardening. The ones we've arrested are just puppets. The true power, whoever has been pulling the strings, has yet to be exposed. The silent watcher. As Miss Marple walked away from the constable's office, a sense of urgency filled her chest. She was no longer just an observer in this case. She had become a player pulled deeper into the conspiracy than she could have ever imagined. The shadows of Fairham were still thick with secrets, and the mystery she thought she had solved was far from over. The letters, the cryptic warnings, the final conversation with the constable, they all pointed to one thing. Someone was still watching. Someone was still controlling the strings from the shadows. And Miss Marple knew that she couldn't rest until the final truth was laid bare.